My name is Yaliwe Clark, and I'm here to moderate this very interesting session on challenging patriarchy in the economic sphere. I think it's a very important topic. Sometimes we think, economics are maybe too hard to understand or irrelevant for the everyday life of the average African woman that is said to live on the margins of the main economy. So I've been asked to do this, I think partly because I've been teaching at the African Gender Institute a second-year course on gender and development, and a lot of things we discuss around the notion of the economy and what does it mean to think about economics from a feminist perspective. So I'm just checking in on time because how much time we have, because we've started 25 minutes late. And I don't want us to leave here 25 minutes late. So can Nigeria just let us know if MM is here and you've managed to get a hold of her? Is she going to be able to present?
Well, we haven't managed to get a hold of her, but somebody's still working on the backgrounds to ensure she joins us soon.
All right. Okay. Okay, as soon as you do, just let us know, because then we know we have to really work within the time limit. And if she's not here, then we do have some time to play around with. Effectively, we've eaten into the time for one whole presentation slot. And I'm keen not to cut the question and answer too much. Okay, so we have a set of questions here just to get us going. Why should feminist work target economists? What are the broad feminist critiques of the economy? What are the feminist critiques of measuring economies? How are women marginalized in the economy? It's very big questions, huh? And I think just to get us going, I thought I would speak to some of the main arguments that I've been talking about with my students and getting them to write about. And one of the first things we answer, in answering the first question, why is it that as feminists we need to talk about economics? Because the way development and the way are spoken about is in terms of economics, right? So if you look at governments, if you look at international agencies, they talk about development in terms of what? Income. And they talk about it in terms of cash income. They talk about it in terms of trade, unemployment, markets, tax systems. Basically, it's a language that makes us have to think about economy being this space in which we trade and we earn an income. This is despite the fact that actually a lot of people live outside that economy, especially on the African continent, right? There are a lot of people who, I must look here, not virtual faces, but yeah, these are faces. So this is one of the things, because of the way development is spoken about in this economic language, that we need to be able to understand that language and critique the way in which patriarchy is manifested and perpetuated in it. It talks about consumers' rights, individual choice, profit-making, capital accumulation. These are ways of thinking about exchange and trade that tend to have a perspective, it's argued, a masculine perspective, a kind of male bias. And so we need to be able to see, okay, that is problematic from our perspective. There are people, and a lot of women, that live outside this cash economy, right? We are not, if we look at employment statistics worldwide, women are not necessarily benefiting from formal employment and may not have a formal income as is discussed in a lot of development economics. And the other thing, main critique of the economy we have is that it doesn't take into account the lived realities of women. So we may have a formal job, the few of us will have it, but we're managing many other roles that the way the economy is described doesn't capture. So even if I'm so-called unemployed, I'm looking after children. And it's not seen as formal employment. Even if it is not captured economically, I don't get an income from it, it's therefore not captured as employment. It's definitely a kind of labor that needs to be recognized. We also are taking on community roles a lot, and that is not considered to be part of what it means to make an economy function. So a lot of women hold family positions, community positions. And so there's a lot of talk, you'll find feminists talk about the triple role of women in the economy and how employment statistics will not reflect that. Gross domestic product, you know, what an economy produces on a macro level will not count, you know, the taking care of the family, the community role. So we critique that a lot. And what feminists have argued is that we actually need new indicators of the economy. We cannot rely on the gross domestic product. We cannot rely on it because what it is, it measures what is being traded and what is the value of what is being traded, what is the value of what is being produced. But that is not going to reflect my life. If production is measured as industry, if production is measured as trade across borders or trade that involves passing through some government structure that can tax it, how many times do we buy things that, you know, from markets where there isn't necessarily that kind of tracking? So there's new indicators such as Shireen Hassim talked about. She called it the global gender gap. It can also be called the Gender Development Index. And what that does is it takes income or production and it corrects it for gender inequality. So you'll have, as feminists, we're not happy with the way the economy is measured. So we've created our own indicators. And the Gender-Related Development Index will take gender differences between men and women along the lines of life expectancy, education, and also income, but measured a little bit differently, and then correct the overall development index. So if there's employment, but there's more men employed than women, then that means that country's sort of employment statistics will be corrected down. That's not a very good statistic to have, you know, a certain gender with less jobs. And we also have the gender empowerment measure, and that one looks at gender gaps between men and women, and they weight that across, again, income, economic participation and decision making, so women holding managerial and professional jobs, and also political participation and decision making, women in leadership positions, public leadership position, as Shireen was talking about. So this is what feminists do. We say, look, the usual way you measure the economy doesn't capture our lived reality. It's male biased. It's got a masculine understanding of exchange, of trade. We work outside the cash economy. Some of us don't have bank accounts. So how do you know what our livelihood is like? Some of us are not formally employed. How do you know what's going on with our lives? And then we suggest alternative indicators and ways of looking at economy differently. The other thing we do is we say, okay, if this is how the economy is going to be assessed through these indicators, we add our own indicators and we do a tracking for the government. Health, how many women are benefiting from this new hospital? What is being, services are being provided in this hospital? Are they the kinds of services that women need? So budget tracking, gender budgeting programs are also very typical things that feminists have done. The other thing feminists will do is say, okay, if this is the big wealth economy, the oil industry, the mining sector, land, all these resources at the macro level that statistics show women don't have access to, it's a project, a feminist project, to then say, okay, we're going to access those spaces. And that's why I'm very happy that we've got MM, I hope she can make it, to talk about Nigeria's oil industry and what does it mean to make a point to point out what it is that oil industry does and what it does not do for women's realities. I'll just end with the last point. The other thing that feminists do is we work outside the way the economy is measured. So a lot of the measurements and the tracking and the idea of development is based on a formal economy. What do I mean? An economy that where there is evidence of material gain and exchange that is often tracked, like I said, through some sort of government taxing system, employment, or some paperwork showing somebody's employed by somebody and somebody's benefiting something. However, a lot of people, especially women, live outside that. We trade, we share when we don't necessarily require a job to do that. We do it all the time in our community work. We have creches. The government doesn't know we have a creche until we register it. We have markets, and this is a whole economic sphere that is unknown or not well recognized. Domestic work, the work that those we all do, we all take care of each other, this caregiving role. Some are paid for it, and paid in their rights are not protected. So it's good that we have Wilhelmina here to talk about a very important part of the informal economy that is linked to women's stereotypical gender role of caregiving. The other area in which it's a growing area of economy, and we're talking about it from the perspective of economy, not only health, is the caregiving economy that's now linked to what it means to address HIV/AIDS and other public health matters. And we know that hospitals are inadequate for taking and actually are very detrimental to actually recognizing the kind of care that goes on in the family and in hospital spaces. That has nothing to do with the paid workers in the hospitals. There's a whole care economy that we need to understand. So feminists also bring in new ways of thinking about the economy, and sometimes say, okay, it is informal, let it stay informal, but let us understand who these people are and what rights need to be protected. What does it mean to be a woman to work in this economy? So I think Wilhelmina's presentation will really help us understand that. I'll talk about microfinance just before we have Anne Mutahi talk about her experiences. She's got a lot of experience working within banking systems, but also establishing and running women's microfinance projects. And that's another big thing that has gained ground with the link between feminism and the economy. So how can we benefit from the cash economy outside these big multilateral organizations and work at the grassroots? Micro businesses, women are known, especially in Africa, to be great marketeers and traders, and that has been a source of both economic and political power historically on the continent. So how about we grab that space as feminists and call that an integral part of challenging the mainstream way in which the economy is spoken about, which premises masculine, certain masculine capitalist patriarchal ways of thinking about the economy. So those are the kinds of things we're going to be going for. And yes, I'm just under my 10 minutes. So we're going to move into our first presentation from Wilhelmina Trout, who is a friend of mine. So I'm so happy that she's a friend of mine, because she's also a friend of my mother. But she was first my mother's friend. But I think now she's becoming more of my friend. So I'm going to, deal with my mother later. So Wilhelmina Trout she has been working for a long time with international and local unionized activist work from her feminist politics. So she's been involved, a member of the World March of Women, which is an international unionized workspace that I learn about every time she tells me what she's been doing. I never knew the space existed 2 years ago. And she's served on an international committee there for quite a few years. She's not leading that now, but she took a strong role there. And she's also been involved historically in South Africa with COSATU, in COSATU, outside COSATU. Right now, she's going to talk about the domestic workers union that is affiliated to COSATU, and COSATU is it's a trade union, local trade union that was actually integral in terms of the anti-apartheid struggle, and still is integral in many ways in terms of our political. There's another organization. I told Wilhelmina that she's a member of many organizations. Which ones can I talk about? So I hope she will tell us more about her work. So over to you, Wilhelmina. You'll have about 25 minutes because we'll have question and answer later after we hear the other presentation. So you have the full 25. So tell us about your work and your life, as well as Domestic Workers Union as an area of the informal sector in which women's rights have not been acknowledged. And this is where I think that the whole point about the triple role that women perform is sort of not quite understood. And I think Domestic Workers Union spaces help us understand what it means to recognize that. So over to you.
Thanks. I like calling her Yaya. I like that nickname. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the Heinrich Böll Foundation for inviting me to speak. Um, I think the way you suggested I do it is a good idea because, as you said, you know, we women, feminists, we do things in a different way. And it starts with us, our own lives, and telling our own stories. And in that way, we extrapolate and we share and we take lessons and we are able to come up with conclusions as to how to improve our lives and how to improve the system. Um, so I'll speak a bit about, it will come out who I am and what I do. But just a correction to say, COSATU is the federation. It's the umbrella body that brings all the trade unions together in South Africa. So it is the biggest federation on the continent, and I think the Nigerians will dispute this. But nevertheless, so yes, I do. I work with the domestic workers here in South Africa, and not only in Cape Town, but also in other provinces. And Mama sitting over there has reminded me that I've also worked with them in the Self-Employed Women's Union that is now defunct. But yes, my life has been dedicated to working with within the trade unions, and now especially now that I'm retired, with domestic workers. It's never been like that. I've never focused on working on women's issues. As we all know that when we fought apartheid, it was all about dismantling that apartheid system. And this word patriarchy never ever came up because we just, all of us, within the trade unions even, there was no talk of establishing different women's committees because we were all focused on dismantling this capitalist apartheid system. It was only after our liberation, 94, that I kind of stood up and I speak for myself and like, when are we going to see some change as women? When will the system change our lives as well? That this word patriarchy came in, that we realized that we had not broken down the patriarchal structures or systems or constructs within our society. Nevertheless, so at the same time, you know, as Yaya said, the work that the care work, the domestic work, the housework has been around forever, as long as mankind's been on earth. But it's never been recognized, it's always been invisible. So domestic work is one of the oldest and most important occupations for millions of women around the world. Today, we see that domestic workers make up a large section of a portion, of the workforce. And interestingly enough, we find that in developing countries that these numbers have increased. Because traditionally, as we know, domestic workers are employed by households, by families, so that women can go out and supplement the income of the family. I had a figure to share with you. It says in Europe, it is one of the fastest growing economic sectors. Worldwide, the number of domestic workers are now estimated to be about 53 million. That's more than, I think, what are we saying? We're 51 million in this country now, Mama. So it's more than the amount of people in South Africa. So 53 million, however, due to the fact that the work is often hidden or not registered, they say, and just as like our unemployment figures, we're always in dispute, that the total number of domestic workers are estimated to be as high as 100 million. So, but as we know, that figure, women make, it goes further to say that in developed countries they make up at least, it is estimated about 83% of domestic workers are women or girls. And we know that's a separate issue to discuss, child labor. And also, in terms of Europe, it makes the point that in the main, there are migrant workers. And the sad thing about this is, the statistic that I drew down says also that only 40% of the world's domestic workers are, they are excluded from basic labor laws. So, we all know domestic work, like we all in our homes, are undervalued. And in terms of the employment, it is poorly regulated. And many domestic workers are exploited, abused, and underpaid. Because, I mean, it is a workplace, a private workplace. So they become more vulnerable because they are excluded. They are not, they're working in a private home. So coming to South Africa, the number of domestic workers estimated in South Africa is 1 million. I couldn't get a statistic as to, about how many of these domestic workers are organized, but just to say that in Kusatu, they talk about that after this a million domestic workers, less than 5% of them are organized. And when we say organized, we mean organized in a trade union. And many of the domestic workers in South Africa, as we know, are African women coming from disadvantaged backgrounds who are not aware of their legal rights, that they can join a union and that they have protection. Now, South Africa has one of the best constitutions. It has the best labor laws, although the capitalists will say to us that there are such rigid labor laws that they don't create jobs. Now, since the inception of these new laws, these new labor laws, domestic workers in South Africa are covered by these labor laws. They are covered by the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, which means the wage that they earn, the working conditions that they work under are all regulated. But how many of those domestic workers know that they are workers like any other workers? I wanted to quote from a booklet that we had a workers' summit with Kusatu, and it says here, paid domestic work is recognized as a form of skilled labor. When they set up these training centers to train domestic workers, they defined that domestic work was a form of skilled labor. So they recognized it. And we also know, how many of you know, but it's known out there, that now internationally it is recognized that domestic workers, the work of domestic workers is recognized as, and I don't like saying this word, but this is the word out there, decent work. It is recognized that they play a role in the world's economy. And the Convention 189 that was adopted by the International Labour Organization, it starts by saying, recognizing the significant contribution of domestic workers to the global economy, which includes increasing paid job opportunities for both men and women workers, etc., etc. Here I am saying to you, we have the best constitution, which provides domestic workers are covered as citizens of this country. They are covered by labor laws. The basic conditions of employment, it's regulated. Even their wages are. Every year, and it's about to come up, the minister will announce a minimum wage, we call it the sectorial determination, is declared. You are not allowed to pay a domestic worker lower than a particular minimum wage legislated by law. Yeah. Domestic workers also are covered by our unemployment insurance fund. In other words, if a domestic worker falls pregnant or she's sick, she can go to the unemployment office and get a percentage of her salary. But we find that with all this type of legislation, with a sectoral determination where I was just handing out a pamphlet here, we will have a huge domestic workers in Bizo. It's just another word for a gathering of domestic workers. On Saturday with the Minister of Labour, we will have it. She will come and announce that there will be an increase for domestic workers in their salary. So their wages are determined, their working conditions are determined, they're covered by these laws. But why is it that we still find that domestic workers in the household, you will find cases coming to court of abuse, of gross exploitation, of rape, because yes, women are silent about what happens to them, but also because they're not aware that they are covered by the law. So for me, the domestic workers union that I'm involved with, it's called the South African Domestic Service and Allied Workers Union, is a domestic workers union that has been around in South Africa since organized labor came to be here in South Africa. It was actually one of the unions that was participated in the birth of this big federation, COSATU. But a significant thing happened. It was formed way back in the 80s, and I'm sure that some of the comrades sitting around the table here was part of that. And it was a union that was vibrant, a union that was visible. But it belonged to a system where to be affiliated to the trade union, you had to pay fees. And unfortunately, the Domestic Workers Union wasn't seen, well, could not pay those fees and wasn't seen as a viable asset. It wasn't an asset to the Federation. And it was closed down. But these women, mainly women workers, domestic workers, they resurfaced. They came back in 2000 and formed again their own union. Now, as we know that patriarchy is alive and well in all of our organizations. So within the Labour Federation, it is a male-dominated leadership. And so the decision to close down the domestic workers, or the decision to assist them, will always be in the hands of male comrades, of male leaders. Somebody said the other day, whilst addressing a women's committee in COSATU, in the Labour Federation, said, we need women to have committees, we need women to organize themselves, we need women to come together and talk. But we need to know as women that we cannot emulate and imitate the male leadership. We need to change things, you know. So we need to not just focus on wanting to get a woman into a position or getting women to be, part of the leadership. Yes, that we must also fight for. But we must know as women comrades that we need to organize ourselves. We need to build a solidarity amongst ourselves, because we need to build a collective, because we want to change the world and build those alternatives like you, Alicia said, we want to build. I've got 10 minutes to go, so let me just say. The two issues that I want to raise around why domestic workers are so vulnerable. The one I mentioned was the isolation in private households. And whilst talking about their rights, the relationship between the domestic worker and the employer has all on paternalism. They're part of my family, they're in my household, they're here looking after my children, they're cooking my food, they're making up my bed. And that is why, in my humble opinion, I'm saying that paternalism, it has destroyed, or it destroys it doesn't give that domestic worker that independence. The independence to say, hold it, I work for you, I'm not part of your family, you need to pay me a living wage, you need to, if I'm living on your premises, I must have a decent room to live in with a bathroom, and that's right, not to walk outside in the cold shower. Let's get this straight, I work for you, you need to treat me, I have rights, okay? But the other thing that I needed to raise before I end is that we must acknowledge where we come from in this country. And we come from a system, an apartheid system, that did not see black people as human beings. We know that this economy was built on the backs of the mines, yes. But who were working in the mine? It was black men, taken away from their families. The mining industry has laid the basis, in my opinion, for the discrimination, for the regulation of pay in the workplace in this country. Domestic workers' wages, domestic workers' working conditions have been always based on the fact that what happened in the mines, those migrant workers, it was okay for them. It manifested itself with domestic workers. It was domestic workers, it was the mothers, it was the wives, it was the daughters who had to leave the household to go into the cities to work. So the challenge is domestic workers, not only to say we're fighting for decent work and we're fighting for higher wages, but it's also, to dismantle this apartheid wage structure that we're living with, this huge gap, which they say is 200 or 300 times between the lowest paid worker, and they refer to the domestic worker as the lowest paid, and the, what do you call them, the CEOs. There's a gap of 300. I mean, that for me is even. So how do we narrow this wage gap? How do we get domestic workers to be recognized as workers who have come to do a job of work and need to be treated in that way? The system that we live under, this capitalist patriarchal system that we live under, unfortunately is a system that perpetuates that, look, before I pay you, I need to make sure that I've got extra money in my pocket. And the boss says in the industrial world, before I pay you, I need to see that my profit is big enough so that I can be living in that big house and be taking my family on a good holiday. So as long as there's a system that it's built on this individuals who has to look after themselves and their profits, and doesn't, like we, as Aliwe said, as feminists, we look at the living realities. As long as those are not the criteria or those that is not important, as long as we do not challenge that system, which is the root, for me, the root of our exploitation and our oppression, we will continue to have workers living or working in private households, being vulnerable, kept silent, and being abused. And then just finally to say that in South Africa, it's not for us. It's also about, unfortunately, race has to come into it. We always talk about race, class, and gender. And for me, the domestic workers sector, is an example of where you see it's mainly African women employed. It is the working class women who goes out to clean your house. And that it is mainly, in the main, women who are domestic workers. So it's that system that is based on that race, class, and gender that we need to unbundle, that we need to fight, that we need to dismantle. I'd like to be able to speak more about the domestic workers union, how we organize, the problems we have organizing domestic workers. So hopefully that will come out of discussion. But just to end to say that an historical event had taken place yesterday or this past couple of days in the history of the domestic workers internationally, and that they've launched the International Domestic Workers Network this weekend. So domestic workers now internationally have organized themselves and have come together and launched their network. So I take this opportunity to congratulate the International Domestic Workers Network. Thank you.
There was a kitchen girl, my father was a garden boy, that's why I'm a feminist, I'm a feminist, I'm a feminist. My mother was a kitchen girl, my father was a garden boy, that's why I'm a feminist, I'm a feminist, I'm a feminist. We needed a song, eh?